All right, welcome back to the Cross Connection, everybody. With the midterms right around the corner, it's not only important to talk about the candidates, but also the people who will be casting ballots. So as America's racial demographics change, the rising majority, voters of color, will most certainly impact upcoming elections more than ever. Black voters in the South, for example, will play a huge role in key Senate races. Latino voters hold tremendous power as America's largest growing voting bloc. And a progressive advocacy group has launched a $10 million effort to turn out the AAPI voters. This is America's fastest growing demographic. That's happening in key battleground states. And of course, the indigenous vote will also be crucial. Races are often run among the margins. And just like it was in 2020, when a large turnout of indigenous voters helped turn Arizona from red to blue in many races. So the political landscape is always changing, and it begs the question, are politicians keeping up with that change and addressing issues that matter to these voters? Back with me is Dr. Jason Johnson, MSNBC political contributor, Fernand Amandi, also an MSNBC political analyst and Democratic pollster, Brad Jenkins, pinch hitter, president and CEO of AAPI Victory Fund, and Crystal Echohawk, founder and executive director of Illuminative. So happy to have all the representation from the rising majority on the show today. I will start with you, Jason, because across the South, several key Senate races hinge on the support of black voters for black candidates. This exemplifies the importance of the black vote, which you and I have talked about in the Deep South. And the South has changed significantly, you know that. This has also empowered black voters. So I'm just curious to hear from you how this will impact midterms. And I know that you happen to have thoughts about my black man segment,
I do.
Black voters last week.
I have thoughts on.
So we can talk about it.
This is what's really important.
Yes.
I think there is a problem sometimes. Not to say that you're an example of this problem, Tiffany, but black men get blamed, and black people in general get blamed for failings on the part of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
When policies get passed, when statutes, when candidates get elected, it's like, oh, the black people didn't turn out, the black people didn't turn out. And now it seems to be focused on black men. African-American men are super voters for the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
You don't have a lot of people going to Brian Kemp and going to DeSantis, but the issue has been...
There are a few.
There are a small number,
Yeah.
but let's be realistic. The vast majority of black men are still voting for Democratic candidates. But the question, and the thing I hear from people all the time is important, is what has the Democratic Party done for black men?
That's a fair question.
That is a fair question.
Yeah.
And I think if Democrats spent more time talking about this is what we've done for brothers, this is what we've done for the working class guy and the guy in the C-suite, you wouldn't have these problems. And it feels like it's setting up a blame game so that if Stacey Abrams isn't elected and if Raphael Warnock ends up being defeated, black men will be blamed when, in fact, most of the time they're supporting the Democratic Party, even if the Democratic Party doesn't always support them.
Yeah, that's a fair question. Well, I know that you wanted to bring up the Latino voter thing, so you had a question for Fernand.
Yeah, so Fernand, and this is the thing, and I've always found this rather fascinating. Almost stemming from this conversation about black male voters, it seems to me that if there is a demographic amongst people of color that Democrats should be worried about, it's Latino men in Texas, in Arizona, and places like that, where it seems much more likely the Latino men will peel off the Democratic Party and vote for Republicans primarily based on economic issues and anything else like that. Why do you think that's happening? And again, we oftentimes say Latino as if it's a huge group. You could be talking about Guatemalans, Mexican Americans, all sorts of different kinds of people. Is that really happening, and why is it happening, and what can Dems do this fall in 46 days to make up for some of those losses?
Jason, there's no doubt that to the extent that there has been a little bit of a slight drop-off with Hispanic support for Democrats, it really is zeroing in on Hispanic men. But I actually think, Jason, this time around, especially as you target in on correctly, those economic bread and butter issues and how a difference in who is running the government makes a difference in the lives of not just Latino men, but black men and all Americans for that matter. You've seen this administration now pass laws that impact directly prescription drug costs. They're not going to be much lower. They have fortified access to the Affordable Care Act, because lack of access to health care was a debilitating economic event for Hispanic men, black men, and people all across the rising majority, coupled with the fact that we've seen over 10 million jobs created in less than 2 years. This is a fantastic story that if black men, Hispanic men, all of the spectrum of voters in that rising majority aren't paying attention to and voting in favor of, then they really are voting against their interests. Jason, one other point you made earlier with Tiffany, I got to comment on. I think you're right. There are always a series of grievances that people in this rising majority may have with the Democratic Party. But we have to point out what the contrast is here. If the Republicans take control again of the government, It is an autocratic fascist process that is designed to take away all rights of the rising majority, black men, black women, Hispanic women, all across the AAPI community. That is what we need to tell voters and focus on, not those grievances on the margins.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's the point I was making last week for the people who do end up voting, shifting, going to the other side. Crystal, I want to bring you in the conversation because one thing I don't see enough of, and that is censoring the indigenous vote, Native American vote. Now, I know there was, I think, a candidate forum in Georgia a few weeks ago, and there's certainly been presidential candidate forums. Not all the candidates show up all the time. But just curious your thoughts on the role that the indigenous voters play. And we also saw history made in Alaska. So for the first time, Congress has full indigenous representation. Far overdue and a little ridiculous considering we are literally sitting on native land right now. Your thoughts, Crystal?
Exactly. 233 years, and we finally have a Native American, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian representation in the House. Long overdue, and it's really exciting because Native peoples are building power. But you're right. I think people are constantly discounting the Native American vote, and we broke records in 2020. As was mentioned, you know, our people made a huge difference in the results in numerous races in Arizona. But also, if you really go in and look at the data in Nevada, Wisconsin, and other places, the Native vote had a really significant impact in 2020. And when we look at how polarized things are, and we're talking about razor-thin margins, every vote truly counts, and the Native vote is one of those that people really need to be paying attention to. And we, you know, I think there's a false narrative out there that our people don't vote, that we're disengaged. We just did a survey earlier this year called the Indigenous Futures Survey. We polled nearly 5,000 Native Americans in 49 states, and 84% reported in voting in 2020, and nearly 80% said they plan to turn out and vote in the midterm elections. So everyone needs to be paying attention to the Native American voter in every state.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when the point you make, these races are often won on the margins, particularly this go round. Brad, the API community, fastest growing demographic in this country. We've talked about it so many times on this show, that among the fastest growing demographic, very few in the community are reached out to by parties, by either party or campaigns. One, why do you think that is? And two, what will it take to change that?
Yeah, well, Tiffany, first, huge congrats and thank you to the Cross Connection, because you do this. You center our community every weekend in a way that very few do, so thank you for that. And you're right. I mean, look, at the end of the day, as you mentioned, we're the fastest growing demographic in the United States. And sadly, the Democratic Party, I'm going to call you all out. We're sort of the last community that are thought of in any shape or form when it comes to polling, when it comes to voter data file cleanup, when it comes to actually inspiring and motivating our community to the polls. And we had record turnout last cycle, especially in states like Georgia. And so you had that graphic. There's incredible investment into our community, from our community. We can't wait for anyone to do this for us. And so we're investing, you know, look, we're talking about Latinos in Texas. We're talking about Asian Americans in states like Georgia, Nevada, Arizona. We have to invest in our demographic in a way that, again, we're not a monolith. It's very different reaching South Asians in Gwinnett County, Georgia, than Filipino Americans in Clark County, Nevada. And so the fact that we're doing this, the fact that there's actual real investment in our community is going to pay dividends. The only way we win, Tiffany, these midterms, the only way Democrats win, and Jason put it perfectly, is we actually invest in voters of color. And not just this souls to the polls last 10 days, which always happens.
Exactly.
I'm calling out the Democratic Party here. We get these last 10 days, oh, let's do a bus tour. No, we have to engaging our community weeks, months in advance. We have to treat them like they're white persuadable voters in the suburbs. Why do we treat white voters as persuadables, but we don't treat the actual core and base of the Democratic Party like we treat white suburban moms in the suburbs? So, again, it's very exciting. We're seeing this. We're connecting with the Latino Victory Fund and Collective PAC this cycle. We're doing this in partnership with communities of color. And I do believe, look, I am the eternal optimist, Tiffany. I see us winning in states like Georgia. I see us winning in states like Nevada and Arizona. And in a state like Texas, where you have someone like Beto going to every single county in the state, it's huge.
Yeah. Well, Brad, you were preaching. You made so many good points. But you just heard that prediction, Fernand. I mean, you're the resident pollster here. Is his optimism warranted? You know, do you see people turning out in Georgia and delivering a victory to Abrams and Warnock? You know, you got Val Demings in your neck of the woods, in Florida, Sherry Beasley in North Carolina. It's all throughout the country. And considering that most of these communities will have to leapfrog over rampant voter suppression to do that, your thoughts?
Well, I think that's exactly right. Number one, we have to be mindful of that the Republicans are now all in a committed effort to make voting as difficult as possible, especially if you are someone from a person of color community. So that has to be taken always in the mindset. But I think, Tiffany, yes, I think we're going to see record midterm turnout. I think it's going to be the equal, if not better than what we saw in 2018, which is the highest midterm turnout in the last 75 years. I think we're going to see it again. And I think if we're able to capture and hold on to the Senate and maybe even hold on to the House, it's going to be because Black voters, Hispanic voters, Asian voters, all of those voters across the spectrum of this rising majority turned out. Because the truth of the matter is, Tiffany, if they don't take the opportunity to vote in this election, they may not have an opportunity to vote again in a free and fair election. Those really are the stakes. I don't think any of us can stress enough. If the Republicans capture either houses of Congress, they are committed to undoing democracy. They are committed to overturning whatever electoral result, quote unquote, doesn't go their way in 2024. You even have people like Marco Rubio right now saying they won't necessarily commit to accepting the results of the 2022 elections. This is what's at stake, and this is why I think we have to focus on this issue and how these communities, according to the polls that show they're very engaged, they're very enthused, and they plan on voting in historic numbers, mostly for Democrats, can play that difference-making role, Tiffany.
All right, well, I want you all to stick around because on the other side of the break, I want to talk about candidates of color, because we can talk about voters of color, but candidates of color make a difference. So we're going to take a quick break and be right back.